street, I am told, is paved with pure gold.
All right, so verses 47, 48, and 49 of Leviticus 25. Now, if the means of a stranger or of a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or to the descendants of a stranger's family. And I want to stop here for just a minute, and I want to tell you how this reads to me. This reads to me, since out it has that phrase in there that says, he becomes so poor with regard to him. I'm thinking this means that you've got an Israelite who has become indebted to this family who are non-Israelites and therefore owe a debt that they cannot pay. And so this mechanism of servitude is to cover that debt. You go into this arrangement because you can't pay your debt to him. That's at least how it reads to me. And so then we'll go on. And it makes it clear, by the way, this doesn't just have to be a sojourner, the first generation that comes in, but it can also be his children who were born there. And so they may sojourn and live with you and stay, and they have children, and maybe even their children have children, and so it doesn't matter. They're not Israelite, and they don't magically become Israelite, but they're living in the land, and these are the circumstances. He shall have a redemption right after he has been sold. Okay, so what is a redemption right? Okay, the law required that if you were sold into servitude in these circumstances, there must be an understanding on their part that if a family member comes and pays the price, then you were freed. And so there must be a redemption right. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son. Who would his uncle's son be? His cousin. May redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. Now, this is an interesting turn to this as well, because what this tells me is that this servitude did not remove people's personal property rights as they existed. And so someone who was in servitude to someone else might yet still be able to make money for themselves and come to some measure of prosperity. Maybe they're in a bad financial situation because their crops got diseased and all died and they didn't have any food, but the next year's crops grew. And so a year later, now they have food and they have extra to sell, and they're not in this bind anymore. And so now they have money and they're allowed to redeem themselves. And so that kind of gives us some information about this relationship as well. We don't immediately, based on the history that we've been taught in our history classes, see how a slave could prosper, but they could. And I had a really good history professor in college, and I was actually able to learn that certain enslaved people in our own society could get a measure of freedom and often could prosper. There was one in Natchez, Mississippi. He got freed. He became a barber. He became very wealthy. Interestingly enough, he became a slave owner, which was not uncommon for even the free blacks who were prosperous in our society to be slave owners. And he did. He was very influential in Natchez, Mississippi. And when he died, I understand that the building was full of whites and blacks both. He became very prosperous and was that could happen. It was a little easier for it to happen under the Israelite system of slavery. So even after entering servitude, the possibility of redemption remains open. Now, this becomes kind of important. The Lord provides here a lawful means by which freedom could be restored. I mean, that's the first and most primary thing that we need to understand. There was a lawful. You didn't have to do something unlawful. If you sold yourself into slavery, if you're a righteous and just person, what do? You honor that agreement. You don't run away. You honor that agreement. This also gives some context for a particular New Testament book. Anybody know what that book is? Philemon. Gives some explanatory background for why Paul would tell Philemon, look, you need to go back home. You need to go back to your master, but carry this letter with you, and I'm going to ask your master if he'll let you go so you can come and be with me. But the right thing for him to do was to go back. And unless he received a release, then that's where his obligation was. Same principle is what's applied here. Now, Paul had been independently wealthy, and Paul had a ability to buy him. I suppose he could have done that too, but he wasn't a blood relative, so it's not covered under this law. But a brother, an uncle, a cousin, any blood relative, it goes on to say, or even you yourself, which Paul could have given him the cash for him to buy his own redemption, I suppose. But at any rate, that's setting forth some legal ways in which to gain your freedom. You don't have to resort to doing something that is illegal. But there's an even deeper and more significant spiritual thing. There's a reason why the Bible uses language like we are in bondage to sin and that we have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Just because we are in bondage to sin doesn't mean there isn't a way out. And that is part of what's being taught here, that there is something called redemption. And what redemption can do is buy your freedom. So then when you get to the New Testament, and here we are, all having been in bondage to sin, but having been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, we now are not our own, for we have been bought with a price. We've been redeemed. And so when it uses that word in the New Testament, redeemed, this is the context that explains what the term means. Me being redeemed doesn't mean that I was freed without cost. In fact, it means the exact opposite. It means that I was paid for. The price of redemption is set in the next few verses. Redemption price is calculated according to the years remaining of Jubilee. Why that? Well, because Jubilee was to set free. And so we've got the same structure with the Israelite servant as we had with the sale of land. And so the redemption price was prorated based upon how long it was. And by the way, I would submit to you that the original sale price, when you were sold yourself into slavery, was based upon how many years of servitude you were signing up for. I'm thinking that 6 months before the Jubilee year started, you did get paid for a half century of service. You got paid for 6 months because that's what you were selling. So the value is determined proportionately, just like the wages of a hired man. In verse 50, notice that language. Calculate the year when he sold himself up to the year of Jubilee, and the price for his sale shall correspond to the number of years. It is like the days of a hired man that he shall be with. What does that mean? Well, if you hire somebody to work for you for 30 days, you pay them for 30 days. You don't hire somebody to work for you for 30 days and then pay them for 10. Nor do you hire them to work for you for 30 days and pay them for 100. And so he said it's just like that. You calculate how much time the servitude is going to be, and that's the money that's involved. And then when you redeem back, you calculate how much time is left, and that's the money that's involved. If many years remain, the redemption price is greater, verse 51. If few years remain, it's less. Redemption is not arbitrary. Redemption is not oppressive. The Lord establishes just measures by which freedom can be regained. Now, yes, ma'am. No. The year of Jubilee is an interesting animal. And I'm uncomfortable saying that there is an exact, it is an exact model of some particular thing in the New Testament. It is a general model of a principle of being set free, of being released. It built in an ability for debt to be forgiven, for freedom to be reestablished, for property and inheritance to be reestablished. And so the best thing in the spiritual aspect that I would say is the fact that we can be forgiven is modeled in Jubilee. The fact that our debt can be paid by someone else. Why is the blood of Christ a sufficient price for my sin? Well, the same reason why a brother's redemption payment is freeing me, or the Jubilee is freeing me, as far as that goes. So that's how I would characterize that. So the chapter is closing here, where its central theme has been steadily leading us. It's been leading us toward this idea of redemption and being able to be freed. Israel belongs to the Lord because he redeemed them out of Egypt. And every law concerning land, inheritance, servitude, and redemption rests upon that foundational truth. And that's what he says. For all these, the reason he gives is because you are mine, because the land is mine, because you are mine, because it's about God's possession. So God retained ownership of the land, but he graciously gave the land to be used. And that is something I think that we need to understand. Their ability to live on the land and plant and be prosperous was a extension of God's grace. They didn't have the right to the land. God had the right to the land. And any time that there is ownership of a thing, okay, here I'll use myself as a great example. I have a 2005 Nissan Titan truck. I've had it since 2005. It is not the same truck it was when I first drove off the lot with it. But it does start and it does drive and it does get you where you need to go. And it's usually reliable after a $700 starter. It's reliable once again. Yes, $700. Had to take half the engine apart to get to it, apparently. Anyway, I digress. I do not drive that vehicle. My son drives that vehicle. General idea is that eventually he's going to buy it from me. By the time that happens, it won't be running anymore. So I'm not holding out my breath. But the fact of the matter is, it is mine. And his use of it is by my grace. And if I had no other choice but to drive that vehicle, do you know what would happen? I would take it back. Would I be doing him an injustice? No, because it's mine. Now, how does this apply to our situation? Well, I'll tell you how it applies to our situation. Well, we're going to get into it in the next chapter. So I'm going to foreshadow just a little bit. I'm going to foreshadow the foreshadowing that's going on in this book. God is telling them, I'm going to give you this land. But then he warns them about some circumstances in which he is going to take the land back. Is God doing something unjust? And the answer is no. The land is his. The very fact that they can dwell on it is a grace. The fact that it produces for them is a grace. Who causes the growth? They planted the fields, and they may have even watered the fields, but what did they have to do with the sprouting of the seed, the growing of the plant, and the flowering of the plant, and the production of new seed? Nothing. Who did all that? God. And God was gracious enough to allow them to eat and to have these things that they needed. That is the grace of God. He is not being unjust, therefore, when he takes it away. Let's make spiritual application of that for ourselves. It is the grace of God that we are forgiven of our sins. It is the grace of God that we become his sons and heirs according to the promise that was made to Abraham. But do we have anything by right? Or are those things a gift of God's grace? They're a gift of God's grace. And so if we behave under certain conditions that he retracts that grace, is he doing anything unjust? No. Because we don't have a right to it. It's a gift. And as the owner of the land, of the people, of our souls, he has a right to give it to who he wills. And to take it under whatever circumstances or conditions he determines it is to be taken. It can be granted on the conditions that he sets. It can be revoked on the condition that he sets. And it's just like the medieval king of England who appointed Wesley Lord of the Manor and gave him rule over this section of the country, and then decided, you know what? Wesley's not doing a good enough job, and he's not returning on my investment. So now David's the Lord of the Manor, and David rules this part of the country. He had the right to do that. The castle that he was living in wasn't his. The land that he was ruling over wasn't his. And so it was at the will of the king. That's the same thing here. And it's ultimately the same thing for us. And that's why when we've done everything, Jesus teaches us that we're to say what? We're unprofitable servants. Important language, servants. We've only done that which is our duty. That which is our requirement for the position that we've been given. And that position is extended to us by God. It can be retracted by God at his will. So the theological movement of this chapter, the land itself is to rest before the Lord. That's part of where we started in this chapter, that there is a Sabbath rest for the land itself. Jubilee restores liberty, family, and inheritance. We set the board over again at Jubilee. You can be really behind in the chess match, but at Jubilee, all the pieces go back to where they started, and it's a new game. The land remains the Lord's possession and therefore is redeemable, and it is not permanently alienated from those that God gives it to. The poor are sustained rather than exploited. That is an important point in this chapter. The Israelites are not to be treated as permanent slaves because they already belong to the Lord. They're already servants of God. So they are servants on loan. The right of redemption preserves both inheritance and freedom. You can redeem the land. You can redeem your freedom. The chapter concludes by reminding Israel that both the land and the people belong to the Lord because he redeemed them from Egypt. This goes all the way back. Where did the nation of Israel begin? How did it come into existence? Well, there was a promise to Abraham that one day there would be a nation, but Abraham had two sons. And in fact, at one point, Abraham kind of argues with God and says, well, why can't it be Ishmael? And God says, because that's not who I choose. You're going to have a son from your wife, which is what I told you to begin with. I know you got tired of waiting on it, but that's what I told you to begin with. And then Isaac comes along, but did Isaac have a bunch of kids and make a great nation? No. How many children did Isaac have? Two. Jacob and Esau. And the younger of those two is the chosen one, Jacob, and his name gets changed to Israel. Now, Jacob has 13 children. The original 12 plus Benjamin. Of course, he lost one of them, Joseph, because his brothers sold him into slavery. And then he was carted off and ended up in Egypt. God actually used that whole scenario to deliver Jacob's offspring. And that's how they ended up in Egypt. And they lived there for a while and they prospered there and did well. And then the Egyptians got scared and subjugated them to slavery. And they spent 400 and some odd years in slavery. And at this point, we still have no nation. Where did the nation come from? God. God sent Moses. God delivered them out of Egyptian bondage, and God made them into a nation. We're reading about the whole process of that right here. That is where they became a nation. They didn't have a birthright ownership of that land. They didn't have a birthright ownership to their nationhood. It was a gift from God. Now, there was a purpose for this nation, stated way back when the promise was first made. Through your seed, all nations will be blessed. This is bringing us to that seed, that particular person that's going to bless the whole earth. This is all God fulfilling that promise. And I was studying the book of Numbers with somebody this week. And I went back to that passage in Deuteronomy to make the point when that generation got to the promised land, God actually said, you know what, guys, you are a stubborn people. And God dealt with that stubborn people for millennia so he could fulfill his promise. And he continually extended protection and deliverance and redemption to these people. Even when they failed, there was always a remnant that he delivered. And they failed a lot. And a couple of times it was so great that entire generations of them perished. The first generation in Numbers died in the wilderness, but he preserved them. And there were 2 people from that generation that were spared. Anybody remember who it was? I'll give you the hard one: Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua, the only 2 people from the first generation that actually went into the promised land. And then they would be defeated by their enemies here, there, and yonder on a small scale, but on a huge scale, foreign nations would come in and invade them, wipe them out, carry them away into captivity, and keep them for a while. And then God would do what? Bring a small group of them back and allow them to reestablish themselves. That whole process is being outlined in this concept right here. There is always going to be a way to redeem yourself. A lawful way to redeem yourself. That started, by the way, before all this, even as far back as Cain. We just studied Cain. Cain had a way to redeem himself. He was told, look, all you have to do is do what is right. If you do what is right, then everything will be fine. God's always provided a mechanism for redemption. And this is teaching that. So redemption leads to restoration. Throughout the chapter, the Lord repeatedly establishes these 3 fundamental truths. The land is mine, the sons of Israel, my servants, and I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't forget that. Don't ever forget that. If you forget anything else, don't forget that. That the only reason you're here is because I brought you here. And by the way, much of the practices that they engaged in the law was to remind them of these things, to remind them of their deliverance from Egypt. The Passover was an annual reminder of the 10th plague in Egypt and God's deliverance of them out of bondage. Don't forget what I've done for you and what I'm doing for you. All right. I wanted to get into chapter 26 tonight, but I won't. Other than to tell you that chapter 26 brings in some really interesting stuff. And it is about obedience, and it is about disobedience. And if you want to have some fun, in the next week, preparing for this class, don't just read Leviticus 26. Also read Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30. Because Deuteronomy 28 through 30 largely deals with the same principles that this is dealing with, and largely teaches the same lesson. It just does it with a little bit more detail. And I will leave it there, and we look forward to that study next week. He lays before him a choice of prosperity or a choice of loss. And that is the exact same choice that is laid before each one of us. And so it's important.
I have heard that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun is